Hey folks, just wanted to give a shout out to Dominic Eagle, the author of tonight's story. Be sure to go check out his channel, Black Volumes, for more awesome stories. A link will be in the description below. My brother has always wanted to prove that God doesn't exist. "I've done it, Michael," he triumphantly announced last night. He hadn't. As we would learn by the end of the evening, Jack had achieved quite the opposite. And for that, we would both pay. "Come again?" I asked, lifting my eyes from the phone screen. My brother sank deeply into his squeaking armchair, blank gaze fixed to the wall ahead. Fixed to anything but me. His profile swam in a shallow pool of orange, cast by the table lamp beside him. The lounge felt darker at that moment. It was only around 6 in the evening. Only minutes earlier, the lamp's glow had cut far more cleanly through the shadows of the room. The dark was taking the light. It was infesting the brightness and safety of the room with its ever-growing tendrils. Tendrils that were reaching towards us. These observations that I have only digested upon reflection, as I was never one for magical thinking, never one for spirits, never one for religion. At the time, my rational mind simply compartmentalized my doubt, my thoughts on the living room's disjointed ambience. Instead, I let bemused thoughts reign in my mind. "Jack," I pressed, failing to contain my laughter. "Did you just say what I—" "Yes," he interrupted. "You heard me correctly. I've proved that there is no God." I grinned. "Which God?" "All of them," he replied. I always told my brother that I shared his belief, that I was too rational to believe in spiritual or religious concepts. However, he always asserted that this wasn't enough. In our youth, he once said, "I'm not talking about belief, I'm talking about proof." "There is no way of disproving God," I pointed out. "Nobody's proved his existence, so how on earth would you disprove him?" "Most people plaster religion over their anxious wounds. It's a source of comfort for them." For Jack, it was always the opposite. He sought to disprove religions, all religions. To my brother, there was nothing more terrifying than the possibility of a deity or multiple deities. "There shouldn't exist anything that powerful," he said. "Doesn't it scare you, Michael? The idea of something far greater than us?" I shrugged. "I just don't think you should waste your life on this. It's an obsession, Jack." At this point, in our teenage years, he'd already wasted 18 years on the pursuit, and not wasted 12 years listening to him prattle tirelessly about the subject. I truly believed this holy or unholy mission would plague him until his dying day. But then, last night brought an unexpected development. My 38-year-old brother proclaimed that he had achieved something impossible. Something no other human had achieved in all of recorded history. Now, Jack is an incredibly intelligent man. He works for the United Kingdom Space Agency. But he's hardly a once-in-a-generation genius, and neither am I for that matter. I'm a biology lecturer, but we're both scientists. Both smart enough, I should say, to be skeptical about such a historical claim. "Explain," I said. "How have you proved that God doesn't exist, that no gods exist?" Jack cast his eyes downwards, still not meeting my gaze, and replied, "If you're expecting a 50-page thesis with tried and tested experiments, you'll be sorely disappointed." "So if you haven't proved it with science, then what?" I said. "If you start preaching about the evidence of God in the majesty of nature, I'm going to mentally tune out. So, will you stop yapping?" asked Jack. "I didn't say I hadn't proved it with science. There was a NASA mission last year. I was just made aware of it, and what I learned has changed everything. Everything I know to be true about the laws of physics. I was only made privy to a fraction of the data from the initial report, but it was enough to convince me God isn't real." "Well, you're only giving me a fraction of the story," I pointed out, a tad facetiously. "Come on, Jack, spit out whatever you're trying to say." "There's an edge to our universe," my brother finally choked. "And beyond the edge, there's nothing. They found nothing. That's what the official document says. They found a wide abyss, like space inverted. And that's it. The end of all ends." We both sat in silence for a moment, a multitude of moments. After 3 decades of life, I know the difference between Jack's truths and lies, his sincerity and his humor. This was the former, not the latter. "Are you sure you didn't misinterpret whatever you read?" I asked. "I'm sure," he quickly replied. I nodded. "Well, you've mentioned before that you typically don't have the clearance to access full NASA documents. Important information will have been redacted. Information that might provide a clearer picture, perhaps?" "It doesn't matter," he said. "It doesn't matter how much of it was redacted. I read enough to learn that there's nothing beyond our reality. No pearly gates, no creator watching us from above, below, or to the sides. This is an island floating in a white abyss. That's the universe. Not an infinite plane, not a donut-shaped spiral, and not a large planet-like sphere. It has boundaries. If you travel in any given direction fast enough and far enough, you'll reach the end. You'll pass the end and enter that other place. A place that is nowhere and nothing." I shivered as the room started to blacken further. The table lamp's light wrestled failingly against the lounge's strengthening gloom. Again, with my logical brain at the wheel, I dismissed it. It was my stomach, actually, that sensed something was wrong, that started to gurgle. Its contents were whisked like a thick pool of batter. My body knew that something was wrong, but my mind denied it. Perhaps I've always been more like Jack than I wanted to believe. We both did our damnedest to believe in anything but God, any kind of higher power. Last night, however, I considered just the opposite. For the first time in my life, I was agnostic. "What do you think?" my brother eventually asked. I frowned. "That you just divulged highly confidential information." "Michael," he groaned. "I don't know," I cried. "I suppose I think that the idea of a finite universe with an edge, a bloody edge, is absolutely insane. And maybe NASA will eventually publish their research confirming the evidence in the report. That would be a wondrous thing. But it still wouldn't prove that God isn't real, Jack. Nowhere in any religious text does it describe what those astronauts saw," said my brother. Then he reached into his briefcase and produced a hefty wad of documents. "I'm going to post this entire thing online. Maybe somebody out there will be able to fill in the gaps. Tell us about the redacted information I haven't been permitted to access." "There's a word for that, Mr. Snowden," I warned, raising a hand to signify that he should slow his roll. "Just calm down. If you leak classified information, you'll face a whole heap of trouble." "I don't work for the American government," Jack retorted, rising to his feet with the papers tightly held in his hands. "The world needs to know. You're right, okay? Something important has been left out, and somebody out there will know what. And then we can all finally accept the truth. That humanity is alone. That there's no big, scary God watching over us. That we..." With a shattering sound, the table light's bulb burst, spitting shards of glass against both the inside of the lampshade and the coffee table beneath. I clutched my pounding chest, trying to smile at the sudden startling moment. But I was focusing too heavily on the room's heavy darkness. Each thump of my heart was more urgent than the last. My body was screaming at me to pay attention, to do something. And the final part of my body to join my other fear-ridden organs was my brain. Something was happening. Something we couldn't explain with known science. It was only a blown bulb, any other rational person would say, but you weren't in that room. I knew it was an omen. "Jack?" I whispered, eyeing his silhouette poking above the headrest of the armchair. And then, that shadow plummeted downwards, folded into itself like loose clothing and disappeared into the black outline of the chair. I screamed, leapt to my feet, and slipped my phone out of my pocket. When I illuminated the chair, however, I found it empty. My brother was gone. He had impossibly vanished into thin air within the space of a half a second. Quivering, I cast my phone's torch beam around the unlit room. And then, I illuminated something odd. Beyond the lounge's doorway, in the lobby, there swung an open door which led into the cupboard beneath the stairs. Much like Jack's vanishing act, the door opening had happened of its own accord. I exited the living room, and my eyes twitched disbelievingly as I neared the tiny door. Inside what should have been a cupboard no more than a foot in breadth and depth was a long hallway with mahogany walls. This impossible corridor had appeared beneath my brother's staircase, stretching far beyond the outer bounds of his house. Those wood-planked walls were plastered with sheets of paper, scribbled with writing that hurt my eyes to read. and leading along the tiled floor towards the door at the other end of the hallway was a trail of blood and flesh-covered bones. That induced a round of horrified vomiting, and when I lifted my teary eyes again, the room beneath the stairs had changed a second time. It had become a wide abyss with a wooden desk in its center, the only furnishing in that nothingness. Atop that desk, rolling unsupported, was a small glass sphere, a crystal ball of sorts. Within the sphere was blackness painted with specks of burning color, yellows and greens and blues. The world within the ball looked almost, to me, like the universe itself. A reality globe. "Jack!" I foolishly bellowed into the void. In response, the crystal ball began to roll, and when the globe toppled off the edge of the desk, the white room turned black, as if it had flicked the light switch off. One last time, I opened my mouth to call for Jack. But then came footsteps, booming footsteps, reverberating off the walls of that infinite void. I was certain the place had no walls, was certain that it had neither a floor nor a ceiling, and that the desk had simply been an illusion, like everything else in that place. The footsteps neared, the sounds of feet brought and imbued with divine rage. I knew it was no man, I knew it was angry, and I knew it was coming for me. Terrified, I slammed the cupboard door shut and tripped clumsily backwards. I slid against the wall to a sitting position on the lobby floor. Then I wailed in terror as the steps beyond the door continued to louden, and I closed my eyes. I prayed. To what? I don't know. Any and every deity that has ever existed. Then, I heard the door fling open, and I squeezed my eyes more tightly together. But nothing came, and 10 or 20 minutes later, I opened my eyes. My brother's house was still black, so I lifted my phone and lit the open doorway beneath the stairs. The room had become a storage cupboard again, and Jack was nowhere to be seen. I have spent the last 24 hours hunting for him, but I know he disappeared in that hallway of blood and bones. I pray they weren't his. He left only the NASA report behind, documents still lying on his living room carpet. Every time I look at them, my eyes hurt, glassy spheres that swim ferociously against the void of my sockets. It's a warning. We have taken the forbidden fruit, and my only hope is to not learn any more than I already know. If I read that full report and reveal it to the world, I will face the same fate as my brother, whatever fate that may have been, the same fate I assume that must have befallen those NASA researchers. Unless my brother's mistake was simply to threaten to share his knowledge with the world, knowledge of a god or a thing that we are not supposed to see. In any case, I must accept that Jack isn't coming back. He met his end, an end worse than death, inflicted by something that may not have even been God. Not any god we know. Out of the corner of my eyes, I keep seeing shapes slinking out of view. Sometimes it's a man, tall, impossibly so. His limbs stretch out towards my frightened form. Other times, it is a flicker of festering light. Living light. It moves in an erratic way. It doesn't matter which shape presents itself because they're all illusions, physical manifestations designed purely to make sense to human eyes. For the true form of that thing, were I ever to see it, would drive me to insanity. Mary was born in a black and white room, and scientists didn't let her see colors until she turned 18. She saw something we didn't. Mary's room, also known as the knowledge argument, is a philosophical concept concerning a hypothetical woman named Mary who has never seen color. She has only ever existed in a black and white room. Mary studies the world through books in a monochromatic television screen. She reads about colors, but she does not experience them visually. Can the universe be fully understood in the purely physical terms? Depending on whether one believes that we know fundamental truths about reality a priori without experience, or a posteriori with experience. In other words, will Mary learn anything about color when she leaves the black and white room? It was a thought experiment. Nobody was actually supposed to do it. However, in 2007, a group of researchers sought to answer that question, and the experiment they conducted would have been condemned by boards of ethics across the globe. But these were not ethical scientists, and this was no ethical organization. I would have decried its actions back then. This wasn't why I joined the agency. But I was afraid. After all, they were willing to put an innocent baby in a colorless prison cell, doomed to grow up in near solitary confinement, save for a nurse dubbed Nanny. What would they have done to a whistleblower? I don't know how they found the baby, and I don't want to know whether a parent willingly gave her up or one of the scientists intentionally bred her for the experiment. The result remains the same. A baby named Mary, in honor of the philosophical concept which inspired the horrifying experiment, was placed in a white, windowless, foam-padded cell. She was blindfolded whenever her nurse entered the room to provide food, formula, and fresh clothes. Always the same black onesie, with coverings like mittens and socks to cover her hands and feet. She was also made to wear a facial covering akin to a balaclava, which covered her face. There was no mouth slit to avoid her seeing the color of her lips, and she wore black contacts in her eyes. Equally, Nanny wore the exact same attire every time she entered the room. To put it simply, Mary's daily outfit was horrid, barely any more humane than a straitjacket and a bag over the head. There was no room for error. Mary was watched by at least one person at all hours of day and night. Should she get curious and try to sneak a peek at the color of her skin or eyes, she would receive 100 volts in the collar attached to her neck. But more terrifyingly than that was the simple fact that Mary was well trained. So well trained that she never in her 18 years of imprisonment even attempted to take a peek at her skin. She was such a willing prisoner, having never known anything else, that I think she would have stayed in her room even if the door had been standing ajar. This initially seemed excessive, given that copious measures had been taken to ensure no reflective surfaces would be allowed within the room. Even the television monitor was fitted with an anti-glare screen. However, scientists were paranoid that Mary might somehow catch a glimpse of her green eyes. Even seeing her pale, peach-colored skin would have dirtied the results of the experiment. Black and white, those were the only shades that Mary was permitted to see. And when Mary started walking and talking, Nanny stopped entering the room entirely. Fresh food and clothes were delivered through a horizontal slit in the steel door, and Mary was always instructed to wear a blindfold before changing or using the bathroom, which comprised of a white porcelain toilet and a black shower head fixed to the foam wall. Revoltingly, both were exposed in that titchy room of hers. Her entire world was a box, stretching a mere 4 meters across all 3 dimensions. I wanted to save her numerous times over the years, wanted to leave that horrid place behind, but I'm a coward. Besides, we wouldn't have gotten far. There is no running from these people, and the agency isn't even the greatest horror of this story. On Mary's 18th birthday, Dr. Robson delivered a thrilling message over the speaker. "Happy birthday, Mary," he said in a monotone lacking empathy. "Thank you," the girl meekly responded. "Will there be chocolate cake this year? I wasn't fond of the lemon last year, you see." "Today, we'll be celebrating in a different way, Mary," Robson replied. "Do you know your age?" 18, she croaked. "Does that mean?" "Yes, Mary," Dr. Robson said. "Today, you leave the room." "I'll see color?" she asked rather innocently. Any sane and well-developed human in the outside world would have simply been glad to have freedom. But Mary had no concept of freedom, no concept of a prison. She had no understanding that this childhood had been abnormal, worse than abnormal, inhuman. To keep Mary compliant, her schooling had been rigid, with books that purposefully omitted any dangerous ideas. The result of that? A girl relishing at the opportunity to not escape from her prison, but to simply see color. "Yes, Mary, you will see color. Nanny is already on her way to fetch you," Dr. Robson said. We watched live footage filmed on a closed-circuit camera from our operational room. Nanny unlocked the weighty entrance to Mary's room, and we all waited with bated breath, waited as Nanny aided Mary in removing her black headgear. I heard Mary giggling giddily and unnervingly as the bag was removed from her head and the contacts were removed from her eyes. And then, as her first experience with a color other than black or white, Nanny removed her own black outfit to reveal a striking red dress beneath. Mary gasped. It was an intake of breath so sharp that she seemed to stop breathing. Perhaps for a moment, she had stopped breathing. "What are you experiencing?" Dr. Robson asked. "Is it new? Does it feel like?" "I knew it," she whispered with vocal cords that sounded as if they were on the verge of snapping. Then her giggling picked up again, seeming to unnerve Nanny. "This is why you did the experiment, isn't it?" "Does this feel like a new experience, Mary?" Robson asked with a hint of impatience, seemingly oblivious to Nanny's discomfort. It was painfully clear to me, even through grainy camera footage. Mary shot her teary face up to the camera. "Yes, but I've been waiting for it." "Yes, I know that, Mary," Robson groaned. "But so have I. Tell me about it. Tell me about the rat. How does it feel to experience true color for the first time? We're seeing some interesting brain activity on the screen here, but your words would really help us too." "I'm not talking about the rat," Mary interjected, and then she jabbed an accusatory finger at Nanny's dress in a way that frightened me. Certainly frightened Nanny, who jumped backwards. "I'm talking about that," she giggled. "I knew there was something you were leaving out of the books and TV shows over the years." "What are you saying, Mary?" Robson asked. "I don't understand. Red. You're looking at red." "Red, and the second color," she insisted. "The color you didn't describe in the books. None of the adjectives you've used describe this one. Red is just as dark, powerful and passionate as described. The blue color of Nanny's eyes is as soothing and tender as described. But this other color on her dress is just..." "What other color?" Robson cried. "It's just red, Mary." "Right here!" Mary yelled as she lunged forwards and prodded Nanny in the abdomen. The woman in the red dress jumped backwards, clutching her stomach, and then Mary's eyes went wide. "Oh," she whimpered. "What, Mary?" Robson asked. "Please tell us what you're seeing." "What I saw," she whispered, moving her finger up to Nanny's face. "It moved up there, and now it's gone." "Please describe this other color to us, Mary," Robson said, before putting an image up on Mary's television set. "Which one of those is it?" Mary's eyes shot to the television screen and quickly scanned the 12 main colors on the screen. "It's not one of those. Not a different shade of one of those. It's a different color." "There are 10 million possible permutations of colors, Mary," Robson said. "Perhaps you just..." "No, Dr. Robson," the girl interrupted, panting heavily as her eyes dotted back to Nanny's face, studying it. "I understand how shades work. The shade of blue on the screen differs from the color of Nanny's eyes, but that other color, it wasn't included on the screen." "It was." Mary stopped, and her eyes widened. Then she said, "I'm sorry." Nanny frowned. "That's okay, Mary. I know you didn't mean to. Not you," Mary hissed, before leaning forwards and trying to look into Nanny's mouth. I'm sorry I saw you." "Mary, you're not making any sense," Dr. Robson said. "I think we've done enough for today. We'll do more tomorrow, so..." "I wasn't supposed to see it," Mary moaned, shooting backwards, clunking into the foam wall, then seizing clumps of her straggly hair. "Oh God, why don't you see it? It's... Nanny? It's in you." Nanny looked up at the camera. "I'd like to step outside now, Dr. Robson." Dr. Robson sighed, then pinched the bridge of his nose between two fingers. "Fine, Nanny." Nanny had already spun on her heel to leave. She would have done so regardless of whether Robson gave her permission, as Mary was clearly disturbing her. But she barely took one step before her body fixed itself to the floor. And then Nanny juddered like a flashy bobblehead. I was overcome by a warm sensation across my skin, and moments later, there came a thunderous explosion. Skin flew into the walls from a red eruption of dress fragments, blood, and guts. Nanny had spontaneously imploded. Screams filled the operating room. Some fled, some fainted, and others simply froze. I don't even know whether any of them noticed it. Noticed Mary clawing out her eyes, leaving streaks of blood and tears across her cheeks as, mere minutes after seeing color for the first time, she ensured that she would never see anything else ever again. "I'm sorry," the eyeless woman wailed. "I didn't know I wasn't allowed. Please, I'll never see you again." As I saw a trail of blood run from Nanny's destructed corpse towards the front door, clearly painted by something unseen, a deep dread filled my chest. I realized that my fleeing colleagues had the right idea. So I followed, fled in fear, leaving Dr. Robson and my frozen co-workers behind. I don't remember leaving the building, getting in my car and going home, but I must have done those things. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, wouldn't be posting this for all of you. It's been 4 hours. 4 hours since Mary saw color for the first time. Saw a color that none of us saw. What was it? Why? Could only Mary see it? I was a pickpocket in Delhi until I stole a wallet with something terrifying inside. My father named me Aruf so I would have a competitive advantage in life. He wanted me to appear at the top of class registers and government databases. He wanted me to be noticed. What I would give to never be noticed again. Anyhow, I'm aware that many Indian parents choose A names for children, but the point is that my parents wanted the best for me. Life doesn't ever go to plan, does it? Ma and Papa died in a car accident when I was 6 years old. That would have been enough, but then I found myself living on the streets rather than in an orphanage. Papa often told me that I had Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and fortuitousness, on my side. Alas, it was Lakshmi, the goddess of misfortune, who set her sights upon me. Or perhaps a Rakshasa, a demon. I used to tell myself that, better the devil you know. In truth, I don't know what I saw in that New Delhi slum, and the unknown terrifies me more than any nightmare detailed in religious texts. After my parents died, I sought escapism in Hindu mythology. I would pinch religious books from local libraries so as to feel some sort of connection to Ma and Papa. They had always been devout followers of the faith. I needed escapism not only from grief, but from life on the streets. I spent 3 years living with pickpockets between 6 and 12 years of age. They helped me to survive when I had nothing and no one. That feels eons ago now. I'm a 29-year-old software developer working in Paris. I often wonder whether I would have stayed in India had it not been for a horrifying experience. Something which incentivized me to do whatever possible to get far, far away from the slums, the city, the country, heck, the continent. 2 decades later, I know that nowhere is far enough. The year was 2004, and I was a 9-year-old street urchin, an orphan who subsisted on rupees pilfered from Delhi's inhabitants. My group mostly targeted tourists, but it was an Indian businessman who caught my eye on this particular February morning. He looked displaced in the slums, like he had strayed a little too far from Gorgon's gentrified streets of glass and smog. Displaced fools are the best earners. The stranger was strolling stiffly, in odd, unnatural movements, along a cramped passageway of street stalls. He was a conspicuous man with a navy 3-piece suit, pristine black loafers, and an upper face shrouded by a black shawl. I remember being a little puzzled by his covered eyes. I wondered how he could see where he was walking. Of course, money was the main thing on my mind. Well, food. But money was a necessary precursor to that. So it didn't matter that he was odd. It mattered only that he was important. And I knew that without a shadow of a doubt, as I'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of noticing important men. Of course, I wish I hadn't noticed him. I wish I hadn't swiped the leather wallet from the side pocket of his trousers. And I wish I hadn't seen it. In one of the wallet's slots, below a healthy wad of green notes, was a Polaroid. Ordinarily, I would have pocketed half the cash, and then returned the wallet to the victim's pocket. It's always best to stick to rupees. Wealthy folk often lose track of how many notes they carry, so they don't miss a few hundred rupees. Following this line of reasoning, my friends and I rarely aroused suspicion. I should have stuck to the plan, should have taken the money, returned the wallet and fled. But something about the white border of that Polaroid, brown-stained but poking tantalizingly out of the leather pouch, intrigued me. And I made the decision to let my finely tuned routine fall to the wayside. I let the businessman start to walk away. I broke all of the rules, and after I wiggled the photograph free, I whimpered, almost dropping both the wallet and the Polaroid. It was a picture of me. A picture that I didn't remember anyone taking. A picture of a place I'd never visited. There I stood, a boy with a blue tattered t-shirt, maroon-stained trousers, and bare feet. I was smudged a little, as if somebody taller had been standing in my place previously, and I was standing in a damp bedroom with mold-ridden walls and upper bunks clinging to the 2 walls. The camera flash should have illuminated the entire space, given that it was such a small room. The room shouldn't and couldn't have been a large space, yet it seemed unfathomably big, too big for the light to reach in the blackness beyond the bunk beds. I looked frightened. My head was starting to turn, and my brown pupils were crawling across the whites of my eyes, as if daring to look behind me, as if there was something I'd seen or heard in that unlit back end of the room. I trembled, fearfully scrunching the Polaroid in one hand and the wallet in the other. My instincts was to look up at the man I'd robbed, though I expected him to have left the vicinity. He hadn't. Standing motionlessly at the end of the dirt path ahead, like a rock bearing the crashing tide of impoverished market-goers against it, was that wealthy, navy-suited businessman. He was facing away from me, and that deeply unsettled my gut, more than the impossible Polaroid I discovered. Something was uneven about the way in which this man had paused in the middle of the path. Then, he began to turn, began to pivot on loafers that seemed impossibly clean in contrast with the dirt beneath his feet. He twisted around until he was facing me directly, and I finally got a proper look at him. The black shawl still covered the man's upper face, but his lips still showed. They had transformed into subhuman features, had turned a muted gray without even a hint of red, as if belonging to a corpse. The man's mouth neither smiled nor frowned. It simply started to open, and long strands of brown connected the upper and lower lips, gunky and thick, like rubbery mucus. Beyond the lips and the brown strands of unknown consistency was a black pit, an entrance that led to the man's gullet. Staring at it pained my eyes and left a quiver in my heart. The black seemed to be tugging my eyes towards it. I felt a strain in my retinas, felt my eyes start to bulge. And then, the man started to take powerful strides towards me. I wanted to run. I still don't know why I didn't. He may have fixed me to the spot, with eyes or something worse hidden beneath that shawl. The man took angular strides towards me, with grey lips parting wider and wider to reveal a lightless cavity within, a version of hell ready to engulf me. However, moments before the gentleman came close enough to touch me, there sounded a harsh, braying honk. I spun to look at an impatient driver sitting in a green and yellow tuk-tuk, so I stumbled sideways to let the still-moving vehicle scoot past. But when I returned my gaze to the direction of the approaching businessman, he was gone, and the only remaining evidence which convinced me that I hadn't imagined any of the horridness was the damning Polaroid I'd crumpled in a teensy, quaking fist. When I arrived at the wooden shanty I called home, I was rebuked by one of the older boys for not returning the wallet to my victim's pocket. He said something along the lines of, "You just dropped a leather turd on our doorstep, Arif, and we don't shit where we eat." I was evicted, essentially, but that was the best thing to happen to me. It got me out of that hellish cycle, with nothing in my possession but a handful of rupees and a haunting photograph, a photograph that I dumped at the side of the road before leaving the slums behind. All I wanted was to leave India, run as far as I could for as long as I could. That impossible photograph left me feeling unsafe, left me feeling pursued. To leave, I needed money, so I pleaded with any and every business owner on the streets of New Delhi. A few unsavory sorts offered me work as a pickpocket, but I declined. I had to leave that life behind, and I didn't want to run into that suited spirit ever again. I was eventually blessed by a sweet couple who owned a restaurant in Connaught Place. They adopted me, and I was enrolled in a new school. I had just turned 10 years old, so I was about 4 years behind my classmates, but I eventually caught up. My goal initially was to get far away from the navy-suited man, the man with the photograph that made no sense to me. How did he know I would pick his pocket? I wondered. How did he create a photograph of something that never happened? As the years went by, however, I lost sight of my goal, lost sight of my superstitious fears, lost sight of my religion. In 2014, at the age of 19, I believed that it had all been a dream, that I'd simply exaggerated events in my head, that there had been no Polaroid, there had only been a string of traumatic events which had warped the mind and memories of a poor child. I no longer wanted to leave Delhi. I felt safe. That all changed on a late-night taxi ride. The driver released a series of expletives as his weathered old tuk-tuk spluttered to an abrupt stop on a dirt road. We both stepped out of the rickety rickshaw to inspect the damage, but the driver shooed me away. "You'll only get in the way," he said. I rolled my eyes, but it made no difference to me. I remembered the slums at night. I felt comfortable there. In fact, I recognized the road. The ramshackle houses and empty market stalls looked different at night, but the street itself hadn't changed in the past decade. I had returned to my old pickpocketing grounds. But my stomach dropped when I saw it, crumpled up at the side of the road, exactly where I had dumped it 10 years earlier. I called it a coincidence, but I knew better. The photograph at my feet was that Polaroid from a decade earlier. I should have left it. I should have just kept my hands in my pockets until the taxi driver had fixed his tuk-tuk. Instead, I squatted and scooped the Polaroid out of the dirt. Then, using my phone's torch, I illuminated the picture in my weak, unwilling hands. What came from my lips next was a scream. I screamed not because this was the same photo from 10 years earlier, but because it wasn't the same photo at all. It was a new picture of me. Gone was the young frightened boy in the dark bedroom. In his place was a teenage version of Araf, standing at the side of a dirt road, next to a broken down tuk-tuk, looking down at a mangled Polaroid in his hands. The scene depicted was impossible. The photograph had already been lying on the road, yet it depicted a scene that had yet to pass. I shot my eyes upwards, searching for the photographer who had to be standing at the other side of the road. However, as I eyeballed that spot, I saw only a black alleyway branching off from the dirt road, a road barely lit by a few sporadic lamps and string lights. Regardless, even with no light to reveal the passageway, I felt absolutely certain that something lurked in the dark. The taxi driver stirred me from my terrified trance, announcing that the tuk-tuk was operational once more. I didn't need to be told twice. I hopped into the vehicle and shrank into a fetal position, feeling vulnerable, exposed, as the vehicle, with no doors to provide me even an illusion of safety, trundled slowly past the black alleyways. I was only a foot away from the spot in which the photographer must have stood, and I felt a wisp of wind wash over me as we drove past. With a shudder, I tossed the photograph out of the vehicle and vowed never to return to that street again. Vowed, as I had 10 years earlier, to leave India behind for good. Leave that man behind for good. I quit my porter role at the restaurant. My new ma and papa were sad to see me go, but they understood that I needed something better. Not that they knew the full story. I found a job vacancy with a cruise line, and my hospitality experience helped me to secure the role. Out at sea, I'll be safe, I naively believed. It sounds silly looking back. Silly to believe that this man with the power of premonitions would be able to find me. I'd left India, and that, in my eyes, equaled safety. I would never return to that street in Delhi, so I would never return to my trauma. It all seemed logical. But when I was appointed to clean room 11 on the 3rd floor, I started to suspect that I'd been wrong. As I walked down the corridor of rooms, I felt the graze of air against my nape, a gentle breeze that erected my hairs. Though I chose to dismiss this warning sign, I didn't want to believe. The truth became undeniable, of course, when the door to 11 opened onto a black room with a crumpled Polaroid lying on the beige carpeted floor. My belly lurched downwards. For a moment, I thought the ship itself might have been sinking to the depths of the ocean, to the depths of hell, to a nightmare that have been awaiting me for a decade. I recognized that room. I recognized the bunk beds clinging to the walls, recognized the darkness not penetrated by my phone's torch beam that seemed to harbor some hidden thing at the back of the bedroom. Yet again, I made the mistake of squatting and picking up that photograph. I recognized myself, in a way, to the fact that I was trapped, that I would never outrun this stalking monstrosity. And then I stumbled backwards as I faced a picture somewhat familiar. It was the very first photo I'd found in the wallet. Only that little boy wasn't so little anymore. He was a 19-year-old man, filling the blurry smudge that had been there a decade earlier. I was wearing that same haunted expression on my face, was wearing those same doe-in-the-headlights eyes. It was as I'd always feared. The man was taunting me with prophecies. I thought I'd been changing my fate by running away, but I was always supposed to be in that room, on that ship, not as a child, but as a young man. I was always going to end up in room 11, and something was always going to find me, Something at the back of the room. No, I realized, eyeing the picture. Something in the doorway, taking the photograph. I also realized at this moment that the breeze I'd felt on my neck had been no breeze at all. It had been an exhale of breath. Breath warm, stale and wet, more liquid than gaseous. Don't turn around, I suddenly thought. If you turn, the prophecy in the photograph will come true, and you'll have to face what comes next. But I had to see what was standing behind me in the doorway, what had exhaled warmly onto my skin. I slipped my phone out of my pocket and lifted it up. Then I gasped fearfully at the reflection in the black glass of my phone screen. Behind me, there stood a figure in a familiar navy suit and a black shawl, which had been pulled back to reveal. Well, I'm not sure. My eyes were straining again, you see, as if something were preventing them from seeing whatever was reflected in the screen. And with jittery hands, I dropped my phone to the floor. I almost turned around to see the man's face in full, but I reminded myself that I had the power to prevent the photograph from coming true. So I closed my eyes and started to back out of the room. Those hot, rancid exhales continued to beat in wretched puffs against my neck as I reversed out of the room. And then I bumped into something immovable. Something bolted to the carpeted hallway of the 3rd level. My shirt rubbed against the fabric of a blazer, producing an awful scratching noise. I felt like a child, safe as long as I kept my eyes closed. Somehow, that unsound logic rang true as I eventually managed to sidestep free from the awful creature in the corridor. I ran blindly down the hallway, bumping into walls as I went, and only when I reached the end did I dare to open my eyes simply to find the button for the lift. After that experience, I decided to return to land. There was no escaping that thing, but being trapped at sea made the nightmare infinitely worse. I felt stifled, claustrophobic. I spent the next few years in education, studying to become a software developer, and then I found a job in Paris, a gargantuan city with plenty of streets, plenty of places to run, for I will always be running. I know that now, whenever I let my guard down. A crumpled Polaroid will always resurface to unveil some direful prophecy of a future that may come to pass. And I will try my best, every time, to make sure that it does not. Because I don't know what will happen if it does.